I have a strange relationship with drugs. When I was a kid, nothing terrified me more than the man who lived in the stairwell of our block of flats. I'd walk past him at least twice a day. He was barely lucid. He'd only ever speak in disjointed gibberish, but he would always try to talk to me. Sometimes he'd lurch towards me and send me running back to my family's apartment. One day, I found him dead. He was curled up in his bed of bin bags and cardboard, unmoving and silent. I'm sure I wasn't the first to see him, but I was the first to care. He stayed there for another day before people eventually arrived to take his body away. I now know that man was a heroin addict. Since I left home at 16, I've seen plenty of them. For a while, I was one. It took months, years of relying on a carefully knitted support group of friends and family for me to get clean. I'm doing better now. I'm sharing an apartment with 2 of my closest friends. It isn't ideal living, but I couldn't imagine it any other way. I've been looking into getting to do my A-levels. I like to think that I'm a smart enough guy. The only thing stopping me are the exam fees. Until then, I'm stuck with low-skilled part-time work. I worked at the local kebab takeout in the building next door to us until I made a joke to the owner, who didn't find it nearly as funny as I did. Since then, I've been bouncing around from place to place, delivering food on a bike or picking gum off public benches. I earn enough money to scrape by with little room for much else. Until now. I've known Roger since we were kids. We grew up in the same apartment tower, and when I went to school, we'd usually bump into each other there. I hadn't spoken to him in ages, until we happened to volunteer for the same youth reach group. We kept in touch since then, and he's spent more nights than I can count crashing on our sofa. He was a good guy, Roger was, so when he came to me with the so-called offer of a lifetime, I had to listen. He came over to our apartment at noon the next day. My flatmates were both out. Toby was visiting his parents in Plymouth, and Meat, who you shouldn't question the nickname of, was working the morning shift at a local laundrette. We exchanged pleasantries. I made him a mug of tea, and we sat down to chat. So here I was, strapped for cash, Roger began, thumbing through the classifieds, looking for something to see me through until spring. Then it jumped out at me, print so small I barely noticed it. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a tiny scrap of paper. He handed it to me with a grin, and I squinted to read it. Wanted. Scarecrow. £100 an hour. Stand still, scare birds. Uniform provided. Fields cold, no wimps. Call 555-2769. Before I could reply, Roger piped up. I thought it was a gag at first, he said. Sure looked like one. I decided to ring the number and see if it patched me through to Warzell Gummidge. I was damn surprised when someone actually answered. I sat back and sipped my tea, not wanting to interrupt Roger. So this man says his name's Colin, says the ad wasn't a piss take and he's ready and willing to pay the stated amount. I still don't believe the guy, of course, but we exchange emails and leave it at that. A few days go by and I remember him. I decided to send an email just to see how far he's taking the joke. Turns out, very fucking far. I chuckle and let him continue. He has my attention in a chokehold. 3 days later, I'm on the train east. I had an address and a convincing enough story, and that's all I need. I ended up in the middle of nowhere, real 12-toe country. I had to ask the bus driver for directions, and he offered to take me right to him. I love rural bus drivers. Not that he took me right to him, per se. It was still a 2-mile walk from where he dropped me off, but it's better than the usual 2 fingers you get in Ipswich. So, was it legit? I interjected as Roger began to ramble about the state of the public transport system. He was indeed, Roger told me as he got back on track. I came up to this old, dilapidated, red brick farmhouse. The man, Colin, came out of his shed to greet me. He was exactly how I imagined. Real old ways type of guy, barrel-shaped, probably voted BNP. Lovely fella though, just lovely. Anyway, he showed me around and explained to me properly, for the first time, what I'd actually be doing. I couldn't believe what Roger said next. All I could think of while he explained it to me was the pay. £600 for one shift. It sounded too good to be true, but Roger assured me it wasn't. All of this was last year, continued Roger, when the corn was in season. I finished my week, got almost $5,000 cash in hand, and bid Colin a fond farewell. I hadn't heard from him since, until a few days ago. He offered me the same position. I turned it down. I've pinned down a much more stable job since then, but I told him I'd find someone. You were the first person that came to mind. 2 days later, I was on the train east. The job sounded bizarre, but I trusted Roger. He was a good man, a better man than me. I had instant ramen for dinner outside of a modern cafe garishly tacked on to a 19th century red brick train station. I had to purge the taste of artificial shrimp from my palate by downing a full packet of apple-flavoured gum. By the time I found the address, I was hungry again. I'd been walking up a dirt road, which ended up being his extended driveway, for what felt like an hour. Finally, the old farmhouse appeared on the horizon. I passed the guest house that'll serve as my accommodation for the week and walked up to the front door. I pounded the ram-shaped metal knocker into the green painted wood. It creaked open slowly and then swung open. The man who could only be Colin greeted me with a vigorous handshake. "You must be Roger's friend," he explained as I stepped inside. Come in. Can I get you anything?" Just a cup of tea," I replied. "You've come down from the city, I heard. You must be famished." Some food wouldn't go amiss," I admitted. The evening was spent getting to know Colin. He was a nice enough guy. His wife Muriel had passed away in 2017. Since then, it's just been him and his countless dogs looking after the farm. He served me a bowl of his family recipe stew. I lied and told him it was delicious, trying to be polite. Night soon came and Colin asked me if I was ready. I told him I am. We left the comfort of the farmhouse then, and I followed him out to the shed. He turned on a small, naked bulb on which lit the cavernous room. The walls were lined with dozens of tools. Metal boxes of screws and nails were stacked high. My dad would have loved it. Colin showed me the workbench. There was something resting on top of it, draped in a white sheet. With a showman's flourish, Colin pulled back the sheet. Laying on the table was my new uniform. It was a modified brown leather duster coat, just like the one Roger had told me about. "Want to try it on?" asked Colin with a wink. "Sure," I replied meekly. I lifted it up. It was unsurprisingly heavy. I threw it on and found that the sleeves hung down to below my knees. It was like a straitjacket. It had rows of leather straps and belts covering it. The pockets had been stuffed with straw and sewn shut, but bits of it poked from the worn patches. I saw in the dirt-covered mirror propped up behind me that the symbol of a Sith had been stained into the back of the jacket. "Perfect fit, as always," said Colin with a nod and a wink. I smiled weakly as Colin led me out of the shed and towards the corn. He turned to me, making sure I was keeping up with him. "Fine work this is," he told me. "Dates back centuries, so it does. Millennium. This isn't the best part of the country to grow corn for no reason." He sniffed and wiped his nose on the back of his sleeve. There was corn either side of us now, stalks well over 7 feet tall. A path had been forged through the crops deep into the field. Before long, we came to a crossroads of sorts. The 2 dirt trails snaking through the fields converged here, creating an X shape. Standing tall in the center of this clearing was a towering wooden cross. It had a small plastic stepladder at its base, and I knew instantly what it was for. "This is where you'll be for the night," said Colin, his first words in some time. "So do I just—" I began, but Colin cut me off. "Just stand atop that step, arms out. There's a good lad." I did as I was told. Colin moved around me, grabbing the dangling belts and straps above him and fastening them tight. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but nothing I couldn't manage for a few hours. Once he finished making sure I could budge, he stood in front of me again. With a smirk, he kicked the plastic step out from underneath me. I expected to lose my footing, to fall, but to my surprise, I didn't. I stayed perfectly in the same position, hanging from the post like a scarecrow. I guess that's what I was. "Not too tight, I hope," said Colin, almost to himself. No, they're okay," I replied earnestly. Colin's watch beeped. He looked down at it and then glanced up at me. "Your shift starts now. I'll be back at 6 to let you down. Good luck." With that, Colin turned and walked away back down the path. I called his name repeatedly, but my pleading fell on deaf ears. Slowly, Colin's figure became a silhouette, then an outline, then nothing. He was gone, and I was alone. The first thing I noticed was the itch on my nose. I instinctively tried to move my hand to it, but it was forced down by the straps. I then tried to wiggle my nose in such a way that it would give me some relief. It didn't work. This was going to be a long night. I was elevated to the point where I could see the top of the corn stalks. There was a dull green expanse stretching out on either side of me. The moon was a few days off being full, but it gave me enough light to see just in front of me. I started to whistle to myself, then began to sing. When I forgot all the lyrics in my head, I looked up and attempted to name as many constellations as I could. I guessed that an hour had passed by now, but without a watch, it could have been half an hour, or maybe it was 2. Who knows? I smiled to myself, thinking that I now had at least £100 in my pocket. I almost didn't hear it through my yawn. Quickly, I silenced myself and listened. I could have sworn I heard something, a rustling, different from the gentle swaying of the stalks in the wind that had accompanied me since my shift began. I didn't dare make a noise. I listened closely and heard it again. There was something moving through the stalks, and it was getting closer. I writhed around in my constraints, trying desperately to see what was coming for me. I turned my head as far as I could, bending my neck unnaturally. Still, I couldn't see what it was. The noise had grown even closer now. Accompanying it was the sound of something dragging in the dirt. I winced as silence returned. I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes. My mouth was shut and my breathing was low. Eventually, I found enough courage to look. There was nothing. I breathed a sigh of relief and began to rationalize things to myself. Then, it growled. It was a few inches from me, standing directly behind the post. I could feel its moist breath on the back of my neck. If its head, whatever it was at the same level as mine, then it would have been 9 feet tall. Suddenly, its growl turned into a low whimper and it scurried off into the fields of corn. Gradually, The sound of it crashing through the husks died down, and I was left in silence again. I spent the next of what I could only guess was an hour reeling from what had just happened. I screamed for Colin to come get me, but it was useless. It was a 10-minute walk from the farmhouse to this part of the field. Even if my pleas did make it that far, I'm sure Colin would be fast asleep. I'd just finished another bout of screaming when I saw a figure in the mist directly ahead of me. I squinted and realized it must have been Colin, not wanting to think of the alternative. The figure drew closer, and soon he was standing directly in front of me. It wasn't Colin. In the dim light of the moon, I could only see his face once he was right before me. He had a gnarled, hunched back, covered in a dark blue cloak. He held two perfectly thin wood sticks, as tall as he was, in each hand. His face was half shrouded in a long, coned hood. The part of it I could see was infested with wrinkles and crawling with snails. He had a hooked nose and 3 teeth. He smiled as he spoke. "Why, hello there, young man. Could you point me in the direction of Hemsby?" he said in an oppressively thick Buckinghamshire accent. I blinked dumbly in pure confusion. Who are you?" I managed to stutter out. "I am the Dod Man," he replied, saying it as if it was the most obvious thing imaginable. I didn't know what to say. We just stared at each other until the Dod Man spoke again. "Please, do you know the port town of Hemsby?" he said, in more of a growl now. "Yes," I forced myself to say. "Pleasant," replied the Dod Man. "Could you send me in its direction?" I tried to point behind me by shaking my head. The Dod Man seemed to understand me perfectly fine. "Thank you, young man," he said. "You've been most helpful." With that, the Dod Man grinned, letting his long, blackened tongue flow out of his jaw like a snake. He took his hand away from the walking stick and reached into the back of his throat. He pulled out a snail, which he then placed on my cheek. He nodded his thanks at me and grabbed his sticks again, plodding them into the ground methodically as he moved behind me and walked away, further into the endless fields. I shook my head until my brain rang like a bell. I couldn't get that damn snail off me. It crawled down my cheek, onto my neck, and then across my back, leaving a putrid slime trail behind it. I didn't care about the money anymore. I just wanted to be let down. Time dripped like wax. I began laughing hysterically to myself at the thought that it could have only been 10 minutes since I started the shift. I'd been trying to keep track of things by following the moon's journey across the sky, but now there was nothing but dark clouds which obstructed even the brightest star. My throat was sore from calling for help. I was both hoping and terrified that someone could be within earshot. Nothing came. I couldn't even sleep with the adrenaline, born from pure, directionless fear, pumping through my veins. I hung my head, defeated. Suddenly, I noticed that I could make out more details in the dirt floor below me. I could see each stone, each rotten, petrified shuck. Every impression made my countless wandering souls. I realized that I was being bathed in light. I looked up, scraping the back of my head against the wooden post. 3 burning balls of blue light were hovering in the sky directly above me, rotating slowly. They made a perfect triangle and must have been hundreds of meters off the ground. My eyebrows singed as the orbs grew brighter. I could feel the heat they emitted. They turned night into day with their blinding white light. It was like watching an atom bomb detonation. A cruel hum made my eardrums rattle, and I was sure of its source. The noise hit a fever pitch as my vision turned neon. And then Nothing. As quickly as they appeared, they were gone. I blinked the white fuzz from my eyes, but the dull tinnitus stayed. Beyond frustrated, I roared and thrashed against my constraints. I felt a brief wobble, which gave me hope. I struggled even more and began to feel myself sway. My attempt at freedom was interrupted by a naked, screaming man. I was so single-mindedly preoccupied, I didn't hear him running manically towards me through the city of corn. He burst out from between the stalks and half-tripped, half-knelt in front of me. I looked down at him, more confused now than anything else. He was completely bald, not a single hair anywhere on his body. There was a medical name for that, I'm certain, but it escapes me. He was panting, clearly spent from his recent dash. When he caught his breath, he looked up at me. "They were coming. Now they're here. Run!" He said that in the voice of a boy, then got unsteadily to his feet like a newborn giraffe. He was suspended there until he found his balance, then bolted off into the fields at an unnatural speed. I didn't waste time finding out who or what he was running from. I fought against my constraints like a man possessed, every splintered sound giving me hope. Finally, the post's foundations gave way. By the time I'd realized my mistake, it was already too late. My pedestal fell forward while I was still strapped in tight. I couldn't move my arms out in front of me, and when I hit the ground, my nose shattered and the wind was knocked out of me. Fortunately, the impact broke away the rotten wooden board my right arm was belted to. I reached out and took a handful of dirt and roots. I slowly began pulling myself forward. Surrounding me, hiding just beyond the stalks, was a cacophony of maddening observers. I tried to block out their chattering as I made my way forward along the dirt path, the wooden cross still strapped to me. I felt like a scene from a church's stained glass window. I kept moving at a tantalizing pace. In the almost pitch darkness, time meant nothing to me anymore. It sure felt like I'd been dragging myself along for hours, but it could have only been minutes. I ignored those thoughts and pathetically carried on. The glow of the farmhouse finally came into view. The post forced my head down, but in my periphery I could see the light. With renewed hope, I began to scream for Colin. Suddenly, a sharpened hand of claws grabbed my scalp. My screams for help turned into screams of terror as I tried to shake my assailant off. What had grabbed me jumped from my head and landed in front of me. It was a crow, small and black. It turned its head and cawed, and with my one free hand, I shooed it away. I dragged myself over the feather it left behind and finally out of the cornfield. I didn't want to attempt the journey over gravel, so I just lay on my stomach and shouted for Colin. I shouted until my throat burned, and then some more. Finally, I heard the noise of someone walking towards me. I listened more closely and realized there were numerous people, dozens. I looked around frantically, looking for the hidden crowd. Out of the corn emerged a group of people dressed, from where I could see, in white robes. Some of them piled together to help lift me up, still attached to the Scarecrow's beam. They held me steady while one of the robe wearers, who I could now see were all wearing wicker baskets over their heads, stepped in front of me. He pulled off the wooden mask and held it in his hands. It was Colin. "You had one fucking job," he said gruffly. With that, he sighed and laid down the mask at his feet. The last thing I saw was him reach into his robe and pull out a wooden club, the head of which had been carved into the effigy of a ram. He lifted it over his head and brought it down on mine. I woke up with a headache the next day. I was in my bed in the guest house. The clock beside me read 12:29. There was an almost empty mug of cold, green-tinged tea on the bedside cabinet that I didn't remember drinking. My memories of last night's shift were hazy at best, so I pulled out my laptop, opened up a fresh Google Doc, and began to write down everything I could recall. At this point, though, I don't think it was anything more than a dream. When I started to write this, images of last night were burned into my mind, vibrant and real. Now, it's like I'm looking through a foggy lens. Could it have been a dream? Seemed like it. God, I can't believe I've spent the past hour writing all of this nonsense. I should probably put this laptop away and get some rest while I still can. I have a long shift coming up tonight.